Welcome back to the show. I'm Austyn.
I am the resurrected corpse of Duncan Ryan, returned to seek out the blood of the living for my sustenance on Earth.
And I'm just Bryce.
That sums up how much time we usually take per topic. All right, on the mind today, we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court and how it's been politicized in the recent decades. Let's first talk about how the Supreme Court came to be. And that came with the Constitution, or more specifically, the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. Article 6, Clause 2 basically meant that any federal law, treaties, it's under the authority of the Constitution. It's the supreme law of the land. Any state court or
Any district or circuit court, state court, etc. Essentially,
Federal law.
any local or state level legal system is subordinate to that of the federal government.
Right, the federal government, supreme.
Correct.
Anyway, that's the backbone of the American political structure. And that'll lead to...
All right, so now we're going to just get into a little bit of background, and I'd like to start in 1934, New York versus Nebbia. This was an early New Deal case. I won't bore you with the details, but for anyone out there, seriously look it up. It's an interesting case. Long story short, the Supreme Court decided that New York did have the right to regulate certain pricings on milk and dairy products, etc., etc. But in their majority decision, they did specifically say that courts did not have the authority nor the competence to either overturn laws that had been properly enacted or to comment upon the practicality of those laws. So we see, in this instance, a very removed court from the political process. Skip ahead to 1942. Wickham, I believe, versus Filburn. This was the monumental Supreme Court case in which the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution was broadly interpreted to allow the federal government to regulate practically any economic activity within the United States. In this case, with the preceding New Deal years, etc., under Roosevelt, we see the court beginning to become much more politicized in the moment in terms of the preceding administration's policies, etc., etc. Skip ahead to 1987. The single biggest moment in the politicization of the Supreme Court were the Robert Bork hearings under President Ronald Reagan. Reagan had put forward Robert Bork, who we later found out actually was promised a seat on the Supreme Court, or at least a nomination to the court, by President Richard Nixon in the aftermath of the Watergate investigation. But that's a story for another day. Bork received the most single politicized Supreme Court hearings prior to the rejection of a hearing for Merrick Garland.
To be fair, I don't remember seeing any TV ads against Merrick Garland.
This is true, and in Bork's case, they actually paid, at that time, noted actor Gregory Peck to narrate television ads against Robert Bork. And Teddy Kennedy actually made a very famous speech, Robert Bork's America, that effectively made it sound as if under a Bork Supreme Court, the entirety of America was going to look like the South during Reconstruction. Not a proud moment in the American political process. In a sense, the system did what it was supposed to do, actually, because Bork was not the most qualified judge available at the time, and the Senate did eventually reject him in a full confirmation vote.
Well, I don't think... Okay. I didn't really read too much. However, I do know that associate justices don't have complete power over cases.
That's correct, but the way in which it was
extreme.
presented to the American public, and that's what makes this particular instance
So politicized.
so important, is that in this instance, the opposition to Bork went directly not to the Senate Judiciary Committee, not to the president who was nominating, but directly to the American electorate. And for the very first time, the nomination of a Supreme Court justice became an electoral issue among the American populace in general. And that really set the stage for what we see today in terms of Merrick Garland being refused a hearing, and in terms of, and Ronald Reagan also very much initiated this, in terms of presidents putting justices on the court for the purposes of effectively protecting their own decisions. We know that past presidents have done this. We know the current president has done this, especially with his ACA, which has gotten many court cases. It will probably receive many more in the future. But the Supreme Court these days has become a method by which presidents can enshrine their own legislative legacies.
Any comment?
Yeah, I wanted to give a little bit of backstory too, and I think part of what I'm going to say will effectively dumb down what Duncan said a tiny bit. Just about how the Supreme Court fits into our checks and balances. There is no term limits for Supreme Court judges, no forced retirement, anything like that. They can serve either until they choose to retire or until they die. There's always supposed to be 9. Currently, we only have 8. The way that we get more justices is when a president nominates a justice, and then the legislative branch has to approve the nomination. The reason why we currently still only have 8 is because the legislative branch, which is currently dominated by the Republican Party, doesn't want to approve a Democrat president's nomination just yet. They want to wait until they possibly get a Republican president who will nominate a Republican justice. And that kind of ties into a little bit of what Duncan was saying earlier.
And that pretty much brings us to what the problem with the entire judicial nomination process is at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Merrick Garland's an extreme case of that.
Oh yeah, an eminently qualified jurist who's been denied so much as a simple confirmation
Obama
vote.
did a great job picking him, I feel.
He did, and the thing is, he was
really
someone
highlighted the absurdity of the situation.
He was someone who actually, under any other circumstances, in fact, many of the Senate Republicans had said in the past that they would have liked to see Garland nominated to the court. Much like current Justice Anthony Kennedy, he is a very moderate justice, doesn't really bring his own views into decisions very much, if at all, in many cases.
Which is exactly what the Supreme Court is supposed to be.
Quite. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to be the absolute measure of objectivity in this country. Unlike any other branch, executive branch, elected, moves with public opinion. Legislative branch, elected, moves with public opinion.
Supreme Court, it's a lifetime term. You're not elected.
Correct. And you're never supposed to move with public opinion because you're not judging things on public opinion.
You're judging it on basis of law.
You are basing it on whether or not a certain action is legal or illegal.
If I can, just real quick, if you're listening, imagine if we had the Republican nominee as our president, Donald Trump. Imagine with as very extreme as he is, Hillary would probably play somewhat by the rules and try to nominate, if she had to nominate a justice, probably follow in Obama's footsteps, like you guys were saying, and nominate somebody more or less moderate, maybe a little bit on the Democrat side.
I think I remember her briefly entertaining the thought of nominating Obama.
I don't know if she ever actually said that. At one time, a large group of right-wing conspiracy theorists were purporting that that was the plan, that she would take over as president.
I know that she was asked, and she said that would be quite the thing, wouldn't it? I know she didn't say it directly, like most things Clinton does.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Okay, my point was that normally I wouldn't really mind, a Republican justice, but the one that Donald Trump may appoint really scares me.
Okay, that sounds like you're getting political with the Supreme Court here, Bryce.
Well,
I'm afraid of the political game that I know Donald Trump would want to play.
He's not very good at playing anything with those tiny hands.
Except perhaps Jenga. That can be useful in that situation. Donald, if you're listening, we love you. Not really.
No. Stay off our podcast.
Please stay out of politics and enter the Jenga professional competition.
Just enjoy your twilight years being racist in private.
But to sort of return to the topic, this is one of those things that also has a compounding element to it. As many of you know, some of you may not, in American constitutional law, when a decision is made, a formally written decision of especially the Supreme Court, but any circuit court, any federal circuit court, it becomes what's known as a precedent. In other words, a measure by which future similar decisions may be made. And unfortunately, in a very politicized environment like this, where the Supreme Court is effectively moving toward the will of presidents rather than simply determining what is legal and what is not legal, what we end up with is a series of precedents that in many cases will affect decisions long, long after the justices currently appointed have, passed away or retired. So, and this only becomes worse if the Supreme Court switches back and forth between liberal, conservative, because the precedents from one era may well override the precedents from another.
It's most recent, isn't it?
Sorry, what's that?
Is the most recent president takes president?
No, I'm sorry. Precedent, not president.
Sorry if I mispronounced
Oh,
that.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. In most cases, yes. However, a court can retry a precedent anytime it pleases, as long as there is a case. Excuse me, I'm sorry. As long as there is a case before the court that would impact that decision-making process, they can review and or overturn their own previous decisions. And the court does have that prerogative.
Okay.
If I can, I want to jump into some in the near future cases. I couldn't think of how to say that. I've got 3 in mind, and I'll go in order from least political to perhaps most political, in my opinion. The least political, and you have to excuse me, I can only think of the exact name of the final example I'm going to name off. So anyway, in this one, there's a church, I forgot the name, it's something Trinity Church, and they applied for a grant to get recycled tires to be the sort of the bedding of their playground, and the state, I want to say Georgia, but I could be wrong on that too, said, no way, Jose, you guys are a religious organization, we can't give you a grant, separation of church and state thing. And they're saying, well, our playground, and they're actually preschool too, our playground and preschool are secular, they have nothing to do with religion at all, so we kind of need this playground equipment. And so that's why it's going to the Supreme Court. And this is political because think of, evangelicals who are very typically right-wing Republican. This will kind of set the tone for how churches get funding in the future, more or less. And Duncan was talking a little bit about that earlier. The next case is, again, sorry, I can't think of the name, but it's about immigrants who are found in the country with, say, drugs or whatever. They're doing something illegal, and now they're being held in U.S. jails for a long time without bail hearings or anything like that. The people who filed the claim to the Supreme Court want it to be that the government can't hold immigrants for more than 6 months without a bail hearing. Again, looking at Republicans, look at Guantanamo Bay. People are held for decades in Guantanamo Bay without any sort of hearing or sentencing or anything like that. And that's mostly due to Republicans wanting it that way. So that's highly political. Then the final one is Grimm versus the Glucast School County Board or something like that. I think it's Glucast. Anywho.
Glucast or Glucrest?
I think it's Glucast.
Okay.
Gloucest. Look up Grimm verse, and then that should get you there. So, what that's about.
Gloucester.
Was it?
Gloucester.
Gloucester. Okay. This, in my opinion, shouldn't even be in the Supreme Court. Gavin Grimm, is a young man. He was a woman. He's going through a sex change. He wants to use the men's restroom at his school. At first, the school let him, and then a bunch of parents complained. I think this is in South Carolina, so highly Republican area. Area. It's actually a smaller town too. I was watching this on the news. They have a pig. It's a really cute pig. Anyway, so he filed a claim to the Supreme Court, and obviously in today's day and age, this is highly political. I really don't think it should go to the Supreme Court. I think they're claiming it's a violation of the First Amendment, free speech.
Either that or possibly the Civil Rights Act of 1963.
Yeah.
It's actually Title IX of the U.S. Education Amendments of 1972.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
Reading about it now.
Oh, good. So there you have it. So anyway, Republicans would be more inclined to not let him use his restroom of choice, force him to use the women's restroom, and then Democrats would probably be more inclined to do the opposite. Maybe not a huge deal for everyone in the United States, but it does have an impact, and plus it being so politicized, who knows where that can take us in the future. You guys want to? That's all I have.
Yeah, actually, if I can kind of chime in response here,
Go for it.
and I mean no offense by this, but it seems to me the manner in which you're looking at this sort of demonstrates one of the fundamental assumptions of our time, which is not. It's not really, that you're thinking about it wrongly, because you are right in terms of whether a Democrat would appoint a justice who was inclined to go one way, or a Republican would appoint a justice who was inclined to go another way. But I think the degree that plays in the way in which you think about that sort of demonstrates one of the fundamental assumptions of our time, which is that there is such a thing as a liberal judge or a conservative judge.
That's basically what we're talking about today,
Right.
actually, is we don't want to see any leaning.
Correct. Now, of course, it is impossible for a human being to have no opinions. The trick from a judicial standpoint is for, let's say, someone who is a conservative in their personal life. They vote Republican. They typically vote down-ticket Republican. That person, when he is wearing the robe, when he is behind the bench, should be absolutely devoid of any personal opinions regarding the case that would in any way impact how he rules about it. His personal opinions have quite literally nothing to do with it. It is simply a matter of whether or not the given action in that given case is legal or illegal.
Mm-hmm.
There is no conservative, there is no liberal. There is only legal or illegal.
That's why it's so scary for me to hear people making these arguments about we need to elect one or the other because they're going to have such a sway over the Supreme Court.
And not even
nominations.
people saying we need to elect one or the other. We actually at this point have presidential candidates
Yes.
who are saying forthright that I will elect a conservative justice, or I will nominate a liberal justice.
I'm sure Trump probably said elect.
Trump would probably like to say, I will
Appoint.
I will appoint a nominee who is either conservative or whatever, and
It'll be huge.
and he will be beautiful. I'm sure. I'm sure Donald
I
Trump.
only nominate the best.
Actually, I think he did at one point say, I don't remember the exact wording, but I think at one point during a campaign rally, he literally did say, we will have great Supreme Court justices. We will have the best Supreme Court justices, or something very similarly to that effect.
Better than those people in China. Better than the Supreme Court justices in Vietnam.
But in all seriousness, returning to my point, I think sort of the way you presented that really demonstrates one of the fundamental flawed assumptions of our country at this point, which is that the personal leanings of a judge have an impact at all on, and we should never assume that, because that should never be the case. But unfortunately, in our current system, it is.
Yep.
I mean, I agree with you guys. That's how it should be. I'm just saying why it would be a problem should justice have a leaning.
All right, we're gonna, and I hate to do this, but I feel like it's necessary. We're gonna move to why it's a problem that people have to think like that in this election, because I have so many people constantly hounding me about who I'm going to vote for, since I'm not going to vote for either Hillary or Donald. They always tell me that I'm wasting my vote because, I'm voting for the other person. Oh, you're voting for a conservative court. Oh, you're voting to go to war. It's just like, no, I'm not. I'm not voting for either of that. And the reason I'm abstaining from voting for either of them is because they're not fit to make those decisions. They're going to politicize things that don't need to be politicized. I have personal feelings that we might get into, personal opinions about right before the election. Maybe we'll do an episode about how we feel about the candidates. However, it's extremely terrifying to see people have such a fundamental misunderstanding for what our system's supposed to be.
Indeed.
Okay, we'll get back onto it. Sorry about that little rant there.
I can expand on that.
Please do,
real quick.
if you feel like it.
I shared with you guys. I'm not sure if either of you read it or Chris. I remember I shared it to the whole group, and you're a part of that. What it was a woman who had a blog post about why she's voting for Donald Trump, titled "I'm Christian, I'm Republican, I'm a victim of sexual assault, and I'm voting for Donald Trump." And one of her points was that we need Republican conservative justices. She said that if he were to be president, he would definitely, nominate one, possibly two, and then even as many as five, like possibly, because justices are old.
Ginsburg will definitely go in the next few years, I would say. Breyer probably as well.
So, I guess what I'm saying is, like, that was pretty much her strongest point to vote for Donald Trump. Her other points, if you listeners are curious, one was because Hillary wants to let in all of the refugees from Syria without any vetting, which is not true at all. She also wants to get all guns off of the streets, which also is very much not true. And then she talked about, trickle-down economics as they existed in the Reagan era. And I know Austyn and I laugh in her face. I'm not sure how Duncan feels about Reaganomics, but...
Trickle-down economics as an economic policy is, over time and in a sufficiently wealthy society, a good system.
Okay.
We'll have an episode about that. All right. But getting back to the topic at hand, there's quite a few different kind of theories of how to look at the supremacy clause, I should say. You were talking about originalism earlier.
Right. Constitutional originalism is essentially the idea that in order to interpret the Constitution, which ever since Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court has effectively given itself the right of judicial review, whether or not it should really have that from a constitutional basis is questionable, but it's simply one of the assumptions that we have to go on in the modern era. Constitutional originalism effectively posits that in order to interpret the Constitution, one has to determine the original intent behind, let me give you an example, freedom of speech, right? You could say, from a purely originalistic standpoint, you could say that only protects speech and printed materials. From a more moderate originalistic standpoint, you can say that protects, any form of expression, written or verbal. Or from an argument coming from the other side of that, if you were trying to argue against that, you could actually use an originalistic argument to say that only protected printed materials or the spoken word. So it is something that can be used in a variety of contexts in both pro-constitutional and anti-constitutional arguments. But with that said, it was sort of one of the key pieces of late Justice Antonin Scalia's judiciary theories, and it was one of the primary principles that he used in making many of his decisions.
And this is going to be my argument against the theory that I prescribe to as well. It is too easy to apply bias to. Mm-hmm. Especially, I don't remember really too many of Scalia's decisions. I know he was conservative. It's too easy to say, forget about everything that's happened since, let's look at the original. And the Constitution was derived to grow with the country. At least from my perspective, it's a living, breathing document. So you have to look at every case afterwards and see the precedent that it sets. And just to throw that all aside for the original meaning, what's the point of even having those cases to begin with? It's supposed to build on itself.
At the same time, the counter argument could easily be made that if you don't at least have some degree of originalistic grounding in the intention of the way the Constitution was written, it is so open to interpretation that you could squeeze almost anything into it. So earlier I brought up the Interstate Commerce Clause, a clause that simply gives the federal government literally the right to regulate interstate commerce. Mm-hmm. In the case I was discussing earlier, Wickham versus Filburn, 1942, the decision was made that any economic activity, direct or indirect, that could have any impact on interstate commerce could be regulated by the federal government, which I think if you really went and looked at...
There was a case I looked at earlier, I forget what it was, that struck that down. I forget which state it was. I think it was, I don't want to say Georgia, maybe South Carolina, one of the two. They were trying to use protectivism.
Correct, protectionism.
Protectionism against prices in Seattle is what they quoted, I believe, and they said you can't do that.
Right, correct. Now, but again, the point I'm trying to make is that if you don't at least have some grounding in originalism, the degree to which you can interpret the Constitution is so broad and so varied that you can get it to say almost anything that you want it to say, and at that point the Constitution itself becomes useless.
Right, that's where that bias I was talking about comes in. However, the living Constitution, I believe, that uses the original Constitution as the foundation for all the work to come afterwards.
In an ideal situation, you are absolutely right. Unfortunately, when people bring too much bias to that, they get the Constitution to say things that it just does not say.
Which is exactly where originalism's problem is as well.
If I can. So this is why we elect, a president who nominates justices, and this is why we have a checks and balances. This is why we have lawyers and things like that, so that you can't just say that you can't translate or interpret the Constitution to mean whatever you want it to mean, and then it all kind of recycles with the new people appointed in their positions, and anybody with common sense would know that if you try to take, say, free speech and make, acts of violence free speech, that's not going to fly, at least not for very long. What I'm saying is the living, breathing document thing might be more of what I subscribe to, but I don't really think there's a whole lot of difference, really, in between them.
Until of course, you apply the degree of political bias that we have in the system at this point. At that point, the Constitution itself effectively becomes useless.
Right. If you completely throw... It's astounding to me how many facts are disregarded this election for personal belief.
Wait, you believe in facts? Go away, Austyn.
Right.
Get
what am I
out
doing
here.
in America? Fucking call me. I'll go to Canada with the rest of those socialists.
I'll tell you, I can't go there then.
Right. Socialism. That's a crime.
I'm out.
What happened to that guy Sanders? Huh, Bryce?
I hate socialists. I hope he's dead. I hope.
Having a little fun here.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyhow, yeah. The topic.
I guess we should start our closing statements. Actually, Bryce, do you want to start?
Oh gosh, sure. So I guess if I could say anything. Oh man. Yeah. So if you're concerned about a president nominating a very politicized Supreme Court justice, then vote for somebody you think will not do that, i.e. not Donald Trump.
I.e. no one running.
I mean, I don't think Johnson or Stein would. I don't even think really Hillary would do that.
I don't think Stein's really thought about it because...
Hillary, if Hillary enacts her economic package of legislation, if she can get that into Congress and get it passed, she is going to have several Supreme Court cases coming up over the course of the next 20 years.
She's going to need to pack the court. Anyway. Duncan, you want to follow up?
Yeah, absolutely. So... this is something that is a fundamental flaw in our country at this point. We have taken to making a series of wrong assumptions, and it doesn't just stop at the Supreme Court. We, at this point, want to effectively grant our president virtually dictatorial powers. People don't seem to understand the system of checks and balances that is one of the single greatest governmental ideas in the history of human governmental philosophy. And, quite frankly, the problem isn't in our presidents. The problem isn't in our Supreme Court justices. The problem isn't even in our senatorial judicial committees. The problem is that these are assumptions that the American people have started to subscribe to. And the only way to change that is to vote for people who are actually going to take justices based on qualification and qualification only. It doesn't happen overnight. You can't just change the Supreme Court as it sits in a day or two, but it is possible to reverse ourselves from this course, but what that requires is a civically educated electorate. And it's something we're sadly very lacking in right now.
Thank you, Duncan, for that little insult there.
Present company excluded, of course.
Right, because we're all extremely educated.
You guys are stupid. Email Austyn.
Oh, Bryce. It's okay since it's us. it comes down to it. Country far too biased. We like to take every word said by elected officials and put it through our lenses. And politicians that say things we like, we use rose-colored glasses. It happens too often. I've been victim of that ploy. I'll admit it freely. I will say that. However, you have to stay with a elected democracy. You have to stay vigilant. You have to constantly weed out corruption. And it seems that enough of the electorate has not been active in that we currently have a system that seems, to many people's minds, irreversible. That has everything to do with the situation we're in. That's why we have such an awful election cycle going on right now. The two most unpopular candidates of all time have been elected by 9% of the eligible population. And to see that these two people have touted that they will try to influence the Supreme Court in their party's direction is abhorrent when you look at how our country is supposed to behave. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not going to, like Duncan said, it's not going to change overnight. You have to keep fighting. You have to stay objective and don't give up, I guess. It's really not that simple, but I'm going to make it black and white here. Vote for your conscience, and if your conscience says vote for Trump, I would tell you to go see a psychiatrist. If your conscience tells you to vote for Clinton, I'd tell you the same thing, actually. I don't really know what to do with this election. Do you guys even want to talk about that?
Yeah, actually, yeah, I think that's an interesting topic, and I think this sort of demonstrates just what a precarious situation we are in at this point. You know, for the longest time, political parties in this country have functioned by virtue of sending forth people who are perhaps not perfect. No one's perfect for any political office, but on the whole, competent and useful. That's entirely broken down in our currently very polarized environment. And I would argue that at this point, we've sort of reached critical mass.
Right.
If we can't at least make some common ground on at least some issues, you're going to end up with the current situation extrapolated out over 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, and it will only continue to degenerate. Yeah, sorry, I can't speak this evening. To degenerate from there.
Idiocracy in practice, Bryce.
Sure. When George Washington, our first president, left office, he said, and to paraphrase into the millennial lingo, "Hey guys, so I'm worried that we'll have some political parties going on when I'm done where, half of you will want one thing and the other half will want another, and instead of compromising and working together and doing what's right for the people, you'll do what's right for your own party." And everyone was like, "Nah, you're crazy, President Washington. That's not going to happen." And then it happened immediately. Really, really fast. And so what I'm saying is, end the two-party system, vote for candidates who have policies that you believe in, educate yourselves, don't believe in policies because you're told to, but research things for yourself, come to find what rings most true with you. Like Austyn said, vote your conscience. He's actually quoting Ted Cruz.
Please
Gotta
don't
love
tell
Ted
me
Cruz. So, whether that's libertarian or whether that's green or whether that's some weird party, there's a lot of them out there.
U.S. Constitution Party, American Communist Party,
Prohibition Party, the Coffee Party,
yeah,
the Common Party. There's a lot of them. And there's independents as well. The point is, we need to be working together for the good of the people, not working together but in two halves for the good of the party. That's how gridlocks and things like that happen. Is that the right word?
That's how an impartial judge is left unseated for, what is it, going on 6-7 months now?
and regrettably, probably will never get his chance to sit on the Supreme Court despite being eminently well qualified. I really think, and I know Bryce and I sort of disagree about this, I think that if Hillary Clinton gets even 20% of what she has promised during this election through Congress, I think that her legislative package is probably going to be generating court cases that reach the Supreme Court for at least the next 15 to 20 years, possibly longer. If she wants those to survive, she is going to have to secure her position on the court with younger justices. And, if you look at the way it breaks down, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, currently the oldest justice on the court, a very liberal member of the court, will almost certainly step down during the Clinton administration in order to be replaced by a Democratic president. You've got Kagan and Sotomayor, who are both Barack Obama's appointees, and then whoever Hillary Clinton can, put onto the court during her presumable term as president. I think she will even further politicize the court. Maybe not to the degree that Donald Trump would, but certainly to a greater degree than the court should be.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up, really. So, anything else? Final statements, closing, going once, going twice?
Good.
3 times? All right, sold. Well, that's all that's on the mind this week. I'm Austyn.
I'm Zombie Duncan.
And I'm just Bryce.
Thanks for joining us. Tune in next time.
Good evening.